Today we're going to go over a bunch of things you can do to prepare for the Last Chance Qualifiers for Shadowverse Evolve as well as the World Invitationals if you're already qualified. This video is not a how to get better at Shadowverse going from beginner to intermediate, but more so for the people that are already quite engaged in competitive Shadowverse Evolve and want to take their gameplay to the next level, especially when it comes to that prep time for these big events. Part of the big reason why I'm making this video is that I've gone through this process quite a few times myself, and as you've seen from the GP Chiba video, I kind of went over my preparation process that I do for events, and so I've had some good swings of preparation and some bad swings of preparation. I feel like there's quite a lot to be learned from it, and so today I want to share some of my experience as well as some advice for those of you getting into it right now with the Last Chance Qualifiers, being the first big open events that Shadowverse Evolve has in the English edition. And if you already have your qualification, well, that's no problem because you can apply this to World Invitationals too. So I think the first thing you really need to know before you even start to think about what deck you want to build or bring into one of these events is to learn the grander meta and learn how these decks match into each other. I'm going to have a separate video coming out a bit later going over the current meta for Shadowverse Evolve for these LCQs and the World Invitationals, but basically the top dogs are mid-range sword, control haven, discard dragon, and I guess you could say Uma Musume as well. Now, of course, just knowing that these decks exist isn't gonna really cut it. You really need to know how these decks want to be played and what their optimal plays are. Luckily, there's quite a lot of data that exists in the Japanese edition of the game, and this doesn't just apply to this current format. If anything, it applies least to this current format because the restrictions are different between the English edition and what it used to be in the Japanese one. But the Shadowverse Grand Prix of the past Japanese editions were always streamed, or at least the finals will always be uploaded onto their official YouTube channel. So you could check that out and just see how the decks are being played and what the weaknesses slash like the general tempo of the decks is. And on top of that, there's a lot of great content creators for the game that upload tournament games onto their YouTube channels as well. And so that's a great way to take a look at what people are playing in this current format. Of course, some people might be, hiding some tech here for the LCQs, but generally speaking, don't stop yourself from looking at as much of the data out there online as possible. Making use of data is the most important thing, and that's basically how I always work with my deck selection too. Especially after a new release, you always have this like very fuzzy understanding of what the format is because there's so many new cards and new decks, like what are people actually even playing. So you go through X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, you look at all the winning decks from the various locals and championships and LCQs and stuff like that, and then that gives you a better idea of what people are playing, and you can start refining your deck build choices with that as well. And that takes me to my next point, in that when you're choosing to select your deck for this tournament, you want your card choices and your deck choice to be as informed as possible, not just through your own practice and playtesting, but look at the official website. There's a lot of information for the Shadowverse Evolve LCQ results, as well as, of course, as I said, social media, discords, and all that kind of stuff, where a lot of these lists are usually posted. I also try to go over competitive decks on my channel as well, so of course that is also another data source. So now let's say you've chosen the deck that you want to start practicing, and let's say you don't have to settle on the first deck you choose as your tournament deck. It can be like your first selection, then you move on to something else. But I think a mistake that a lot of people make when practicing for these kind of events is that they play the game just for the sake of playing the game when they're calling it playtesting. I think playing and testing are two different things, and people from various other card game communities have said the same thing, where playing the game is just me and my opponent sit down and we play out a match as we would regularly, right? We're having fun, goofs and gaffs, all that kind of stuff. But testing, I think there is a line between inefficient and efficient testing. Especially Shadowverse Evolve is a game where every single card played and every decision taken or not taken can greatly impact the state of the game. So when you're testing matchups or even like how to optimally play your deck with your opponent or your playtest group, whoever, I highly recommend that you openly test. Open hands are surprisingly very effective when testing Shadowverse Evolve because you can, let's say, start your turn and go, all right, here are my 3 options that I want to do this turn. And a lot of decks will oftentimes have, especially in the late game, various ways to, if not find lethal on that turn, but or get close, very, very close to finding lethal the next turn. So you have a dialogue with your testing group and your testing partner to think, okay, if I do this, how will you respond to this next turn? Or will you be able to play around this? Or if I choose to do this, does this mean that I get further away from my win con or do I get closer to it? Having this constant back and forth and a very constructive, elaborate discussion on game states with your opponent and your testing group will be the most efficient form of playtesting. And take notes, record data as much as possible, because if you want to have a statistics-based evidence on whether your playtesting is efficient or not, you really want to be able to go, okay, I used this deck going first, I won this many games, and then these wins were attributed to playing X and Y and Z way or X and Y and Z card. And then let's say my win rate going second was like this. So then maybe that tells you that this deck wants to go first more than it wants to go second or something like that. Another part about playtesting is don't test just into the best decks. We saw in the first LCQ that some of the top spots were to Earthright and Forestcraft. Two decks that I would say are not really seen as the best of set 2, and especially Earthright, Daria was a pretty big surprise to a lot of people. So I think part of the reason, of course, why they topped is that the people using them are very good, but there's also the fact that a lot of people probably were testing in Sword and Discard Dragon and like Aegis, the top decks, that they didn't spend as much time testing against Forest or testing against Earthright, because who's gonna bring Earthright, right? That's probably what a lot of people are thinking going into these tournaments. But if you have the time, you want to dedicate to at least a minimum amount of knowledge about every deck that might pop up. Obviously, distribute your playtesting time very efficiently because everyone's busy. You know, we all have our own responsibilities. So let's say maybe 80% of your testing time should be to the most popular like tier 1, tier 2 decks. But then maybe 20% of your time could be used on testing against like the tier 3 and below decks, so you don't get got by random stuff that you're just reading as your opponent's playing your cards, and in Shadowverse Evolve that is not gonna cut it. And now when it comes to deck choice and card choice, I think that's a whole nother discussion. Your deck choice needs to be one that you are confident in, and I can specifically talk about my own experience in this one. For those of you that watched the GP Chiba video, you will see that I ended up going with Dragoncraft Galmu, so Disdain, in a format where the deck was considered to be relatively top tier, but like high tier 2, somewhere along those lines. There were definitely decks above it, such as Kuon or Idolmaster, and I chose not to go with them because I knew how to navigate the format, the entire meta, with the Dragoncraft deck. What this means is that I didn't just know how to play the deck, but I know specifically how I should play against certain decks, whether I'm able to take early damage against a certain deck, whether I have to respond to certain turns against another deck, how I'm going to approach lethal against specific matchups. I had an inside-out knowledge of how to approach the meta with this specific deck that I did not have with the other decks. And so even though my result was not enough to go to day 2, I felt a lot more confident and comfortable with that deck because I understood how to play with it, not just how to use the deck itself, but how to use the deck against the greater meta. And then when it came to my area qualifier, which was held in the set 7 meta, I chose to use Natura Sword, which is a deck that I only spent like 3-4 days playtesting with and just took because it's the statistical best deck. But basically throughout the entire tournament, I was still learning plays and interactions, and I got beat up very badly. And I think that that should serve as a lesson that just taking the best deck just because people say it's statistically the best is not always the best choice, because of the fact that you have to learn not just how to use the deck, but how to use the deck in the greater picture. This is a game that really rewards player skill, and this hasn't changed in the Japanese format either with every set releasing. No matter how high the average card power of one single card is, this isn't the kind of card game where a deck's power on its own will carry you. No matter how strong the cards are in a deck, if you don't know how to pilot them and use the tools that you're given, you will not be able to succeed in this game, unfortunately. Fortunately, unfortunately, depends how you look at it. I find it a very good thing because that means that if you really dedicate to a deck, of course, if it's like tier 73, like actual, starter deck, then I'm afraid that might be a little tough. But if it's a meta viable deck between tiers 3 and 1 somewhere, there's a high chance that if you really dedicate to learning the meta through that deck, you'll be able to do really well. Even when using like the best decks in the meta against, again, bringing up the example of Earthright. Earthright isn't like historically an amazing deck, but even then, get clapped up because I don't know what the deck does and I don't know how to approach the matchup, whereas my opponent knows how to play against the most popular deck in and out. So you'll rarely be carried by raw card power in this game and much more carried by your time and dedication into the game. So really focus on playing a deck that you understand. If you have an LCQ in mid-January, you don't want to be selecting a deck the day before, you want to select a deck right about now. Or at least be consciously thinking about what you might go with. Another one is teching. So Shadowverse Evolve is a game that allows you to tech for matchups. And so you can look at the greater meta and think about what you want to play. So for example, if, this doesn't have to be the general meta either. You can see what's being played in your local region. So let's say if your LCQ is in country A or country B, and the general local scene of that area or that country, let's say plays a lot of board-based decks. So you see a lot of Uma Musume, you see a lot of Sword. Well, then maybe playing more AoE spells or ways to do AoE damage or board wipe is going to be the right way to tech into that matchup. A tech just means a card that you play not because it advances your deck's game plan, but but because it basically answers one of the other matchups that you might struggle into. And it should be one that you struggle into, not just because it's the best deck. What I mean by that is that the average deck power, especially of the higher tier decks in Shadowverse Evolve, can usually deal with most matchups on its own. So if you already have a relatively good matchup against something, there's no real point to be teching even more stuff, right? Because if you already have cards that can answer a certain matchup within your deck archetype, why should you tech something like Execution on top of that, right? So don't bloat your deck with tech cards, but think about your tech cards in a smart way. And so again, if you see a lot of board-based decks, then cards that wipe out the board will be an answer. If you see more slower decks like Haven, well then you want to put in more aggro pieces into your deck so you can win out the game faster before they can go live. Think about it in that sense and try to approach the game and the meta in a way that is not too distracting from what you want to do with your deck, but think about your tech slots in your deck in a smart way. I think that overall it's also a scary thought sometimes to people to think that, oh my god, my deck has this horrible matchup against this deck and I have no techs that I can possibly do. And sometimes that is fine because you have to think, is this one matchup the most popular deck in the format? If yes, that's a bad idea. Then maybe bringing that deck is not a good idea. But if your worst matchup with the deck is something that is only seen every so often, you can take that loss. Sure, if it so happens that you match into it in a tournament, then can't be helped. You're gonna have to just basically hope that they don't find whatever cards that make their deck really strong. But it's okay to accept a loss on certain matchups if it means that overall your game plan is really solid and your chances of topping in the tournament are very high. And finally, especially for those of you that Shadowverse Evolve is your very first ever card game, when going to these major events like the LCQs, you want to make sure that you're logistically ready too. We use Bushinavi for these events, which is an online app to do matchmaking and know your pairings and standings, so make sure that your phone is charged and you have a spare cable or a battery to make sure that you can always check your standings and your pairings. Make sure to have an extra pair of sleeves or over sleeves if you double sleeve, because in case something breaks, you're going to be asked to replace them immediately, so you don't want to get in trouble on that. Make sure your deck is always at the right amount. So if your deck is 40 cards, then make sure it's always 40. Do a little count in between rounds if you need to, just in case you dropped a card or your opponent accidentally took something by accident. And of course, just bring your A game, right? You want to have a good attitude, have a good time. And the most important thing for me with tournaments is that I don't really walk into tournaments with the idea that I have to be number one, I have to be the best. You can set minor goals. You can set a goal of like, some people just set a goal of I need to win round 1, or I just want to win round. For some people, it's I want to just get top 8, or I want to just make it to top 16. Or sometimes it's I want to just have a positive win record. It's also fine to adjust that kind of goal as you go, right? So if you look at my GP Chiba video, my goal was to make day 2. It wasn't actually to win the whole event, because winning the whole event means like preparation time differences about this big. I just wanted to make day 2. And then once I saw that I couldn't make day 2 anymore, I was like, okay, I want to finish on a positive win rate. When you kind of have goal setting like that, you will not have as much of a sour experience if things do go south. Of course, if you win the whole thing, it's fantastic. That's the best possible outcome, but you want to make sure that this time you spend at the event is a fruitful one. So it's not just there to kind of like chase after a win, but think about the people you meet. Some of the people you meet in these tournaments will be your best friends for life. A lot of the people I've met at these events throughout my years of playing trading card games have been my closest friends for years now. So treat that human aspect of the tournament very carefully and just overall have a good time and enjoy Shadowverse Evolve. But with that, that's gonna be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching. If you guys like this video, give it a like, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.